All right, guys, welcome to week number 7. Today I'll be creating a video for the leg, the ankle, and the foot, and the muscles and vasculature, as well as the neurovasculature thereof. Um, we can get started with the bones, but again, I want to preface this video is a supplement and it's not a replacement for your time spent in lab office hours. So I just want to make sure you guys know that, or lecture as well. But to get started, we're going to be looking at the bones, the tibia. To get started, we saw this last week. So get out your content sheets and then we can get started with all of the material for this week and do a quick little review. All right, so we have the first bone here, the tibia. Right, this is our tibia. Right, you remember on top, tibial plateau, right? Medial and lateral menisci, singular meniscus, right? ACL, PCL, right? All of that was last week. Right now we're just looking at the tibia inferiorly for the most part. But you still need to know what it looks like superiorly as well. But now we're looking at the tibia inferiorly as well as the lateral fibula. Right, to our tibia. Right here we have our medial malleolus, right? Medial malleolus, medial malleolus. I don't know why I can't say that word, but medial malleolus, right? And then we have laterally, we have the fibula. Fibula is right here. Right, so fibula, right? So this is the head, and this is the lateral malleolus. So lateral malleolus is on the distal fibula, right? And the lateral malleolus is kind of straight, pointed, right? It's kind of flat, straight and pointed, whereas the head is kind of curved and rounded, and it has a neck that you can see. So you can see how this portion of the fibula is a lot skinnier, right, than the shaft, right? So it says head, neck, right? That's how you can tell this is the head because it's rounded, irregular, whereas the lateral malleolus is pointed, right, and it's flat. All right, so we went over those structures, right? So head of the fibula, lateral malleolus. Now we're going to move on to the bones of the foot. Now we're going to move on to the bones of the foot, right? So the first bone that we have is the calcaneus, right? That's this bone right here, calcaneus. Right? That's where our calcaneal tendon is going to attach to, and we'll see that when we go over the muscles. Hence its name, calcaneal tendon, because it attaches to the calcaneus. All right, we have our calcaneus, right? Right, our heel, otherwise known as the Achilles heel, calcaneus. Right? Then we have our talus. Right, that's our talus. And so you can see the articulation of the tibia and the fibula on the talus. Right, comprising our ankle joint. And then we have the navicular bone right here. It's said to look like a ship, so navicular. Right, so navicular right next to talus. And then lateral to the navicular bone is the cuboid bone. Right, so this is medial, this is lateral. Our fibula is always going to be lateral. And we have our cuboid bone here. Said to look like a cube. So all these names have somewhat of a meaning related to the shape of the actual bone. So that's our cuboid bone. And then we have our cuneiforms. So remember, this is medial, this is lateral. So this would be our medial cuneiform. This would be our intermediate cuneiform. This would be our lateral cuneiform, right? Medial to lateral. This is intermediate to medial and lateral. So medial cuneiform, intermediate cuneiform, and lateral cuneiform, right? So, and all of those comprise of the cuneiforms. And if I examine, right, so medial, intermediate, lateral. Okay, and then we're going to move on to the metatarsals, right? Metatarsals are, I want to show you guys these. There are 5 metatarsals, right? So these are the bones between the phalanges and the bones of the foot, right? So these bones here and these bones here, the metatarsals are the ones in the middle. Right, so metatarsals, right, to the bones right before your phalanges. And we also need to number the actual digits. So digit 1 is always going to be your big toe or your thumb, and then digit 2, digit 3, digit 4, digit 5, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? So this is always going to be your first digit. So again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So metatarsal 1, metatarsal 2, metatarsal 3, metatarsal 4, or metatarsal of digit that number. So metatarsal of digit 3, metatarsal of digit 2, metatarsal of digit 1. And then after our metatarsals, we have our phalanges, right? Phalanges plural, phalanx singular. So remember our big toe, it does not have an intermediate phalanx. It only has a proximal and a distal phalanx. Whereas the rest of the phalanxes have the rest of the phalanges, sorry, the rest of the phalanges have intermediate, proximal, and distal. Right. So if we look at the big toe here, it's a proximal phalanx and a distal phalanx, right? No intermediate phalanx, right? That's the big toe. Or digit 1, right? Proximal, distal phalanx of digit 1. When I look at digit 2, it has a proximal, as an intermediate, and it has a distal phalanx. Similarly with the third digit, it has a proximal, intermediate, distal, fourth digit, proximal, intermediate, distal, phalanx, right? And then we have our last toe, proximal, intermediate, distal phalanx of the big toe, right? I mean of the small or the digit 5. 1 second, guys. So again, right? So our big toe is the only, or our big toe or digit 1 is the only digit that only has a proximal and a distal phalanx, whereas the other digits have a proximal, intermediate, and a distal phalanx. So now that we got that covered, let's move on to the actual muscles, right? So remember phalanges, plural, right? So phalanges would be if I was selecting multiple, right? These would all be the distal phalanges. These would all be the middle or intermediate. Intermediate, please write intermediate phalanges, and these would all be the proximal phalanges. Right? All would be proximal. Now we're going to move on to the muscles of the anterior compartment. All right, so now I have the anterior leg up here on the platform. Okay, now I'm going to remove the fascia just so we can see the actual muscles, right? So some of the nerves aren't there. So I might actually keep the fascia just so we can make sure all the neurovasculature is there. But, right, so anterior leg. Last week we were looking at the thigh and the knee joint, right? So this is the leg. So if I remove the fascia here, right, this is our tibia, our shin bone, right? We just saw the actual bone, right? The bone structures previously, right? So this is our tibia. Again, remember this is medial and this is lateral. So if I move lateral to the tibia, I have the first muscle, tibialis anterior. Right? This is just going from your leg to your tarsals, or your tibia to your tarsals. Remove the fascia here. So it's really just touching the medial cuneiform and the first metatarsal. Right? And this muscle is responsible for dorsiflexing the ankle, right? So when you dorsiflex, that's moving the ankle, right? Or the moving the foot up, right? Your toes are going to be pointing up when you're dorsiflexing. Right? So your toes are going to be pointed up, whereas plantar flexion, your toes are going to be pointed towards the floor. So it's going to be dorsiflexing your ankle, right? And this is innervated by the deep fibular nerve, right? So if we look at some of the neurovasculature on the posterior, right, we can see the tibial nerve, and we can also see the common fibular nerve. That's the sural nerve. So let me remove some of these stuff on the. All right, so our common fibular wasn't selected, so I went and selected that. So we go from our sciatic nerve at the top here. Right, so our sciatic nerve would be about here. We have our tibial nerve, right? And then we have our common fibular nerve here, right? So our tibial nerve comes all the way down, right, in the posterior, and we'll be able to see that better later. But we also have our common fibular nerve that splits into our superficial and our deep fibular nerve, right? So I want to show you guys that branching. Right, so tibial nerve, you see it running all the way down the posterior, right, and the between those muscles there. And the common fibular here deep in the superficial fibular. Okay, so I want to examine those as well so you can see how those branch, right? So we have our sciatic nerve, right, superior, then we have our tibial nerve and our common fibular nerve, right? So these are the two branches of our sciatic nerve. And then our common fibular nerve splits into our superficial and our deep fibular nerve, right? So our deep is going to run in the anterior, so this is your deep, right? So this nerve here is your deep, and your superficial is going to run more in your lateral compartment, right? So this is our lateral compartment, and then it's going to come anterior. Right, so I'll show you guys that a little bit better later, but remember our deep is going to be in our anterior, and we're going to mostly see our superficial and our lateral moving to our anterior compartment. So now that we have those bearings down, let's move on to the actual muscles that we were being able to see earlier. Okay, so we looked at our tibialis anterior previously. Let's remove our tibialis anterior. So tibialis anterior, I'm going to remove it. Right, so if I remove tibialis anterior, right, so that's what I just removed. Hide, remove. Right, so this is tibialis anterior. So remember when you're looking at the anterior, the happy day. So the first muscle of that acronym is the. So tibialis anterior for the. Happy, we're remembering it as extensor hallucis longus. So the happy day, tibialis anterior, the extensor hallucis longus, right? So and then day extensor digitorum longus. So the happy day. So this is the happy for this is the happy here, sorry. This is the happy and this is the day. So the first muscle tibialis anterior, we remove that and then we can see our deep fibular nerve, right? Also, we can see our anterior tibial artery and vein, right? So running with our deep fibular nerve, we can see our anterior tibial artery and vein. Right? That's all in between tibialis anterior and extensor hallucis longus. Right, so that's the next muscle here, extensor hallucis longus. It goes from the leg to phalanx 1, and it's responsible for dorsiflexing the ankle and extending the big toe, or extending digit 1. Right, you see how it travels all the way to the big toe, extensor hallucis longus. And then we have extensor digitorum longus, right there, right next to extensor hallucis longus. It goes from the leg all the way to the tarsals. And it's extending the toes and dorsiflexing the ankle. Right, so all the muscles of the anterior compartment are going to either dorsiflex the ankle or extend the toes or one toe, or the digits or one digit, right? So the digitorum is going to extend digits 2 through 5, whereas the hallucis is going to extend digit 1. So hallucis means big toe, and digitorum means digits. So that makes sense. Now we're going to move on to our lateral compartment. So let me get that ready. And one thing I do want to show you as well is with the anterior tibial artery and vein, right? As I have selected here, they are branches from the popliteal artery and vein, right? So there's a continuation. So popliteal artery and vein, right? Right, those branch into the anterior tibial artery and vein, right? They have other branches that I'm going to show you in the posterior, but for the anterior, the popliteal artery and vein branch into the anterior tibial artery and vein, right? There's other branches, but we'll go over those later. Okay, now we're looking at the lateral compartment, and the major function of the lateral compartment is going to be eversion of the ankle, right? So eversion speaks of something that's going to be external or everted, right? So basically moving the ankle laterally. So eversion is going to be moving the ankle away from the medial side, right? So the ankle is going to be moving like this. So eversion. Right, so your ankle is going to be moving in this direction. The first muscle that we're going to look at is fibularis longus. Right, so we can tell we're on the lateral side 1 because we can see the fibula here. Right, so if I examine, this is lateral, this is medial. Right, so if I move the fibula there, if you look at fibularis longus, press this muscle here, I examine, you can see it's going from the fibula all the way to the metatarsals. And again, responsible for foot eversion. And then the muscle directly under it, fibularis brevis. It is again going from the fibula all the way to the metatarsals, right? All the way to the metatarsals, right? But more so just metatarsal 5. But yeah, I mean, it's not as high as the fibularis longus is on the fibula, right? So the fibularis longus is near the head, whereas the fibularis brevis is more so near the shaft. Right, so if I just press that, right, so it's a lot lower, so on the fibula. If I press the fibula here so you can actually see that, right, you can kind of see how it's not as high as fibularis longus. Fibularis longus is more so on the head, fibularis brevis is more so on the shaft of the fibula. Sorry, fibularis brevis is on the shaft, fibularis longus is on the head. Okay, now we're going to move to the actual vasculature that we can see in the lateral compartment, right? So we saw fibularis longus and brevis, and I want to show you the superficial fibular nerve. So remember we were talking about the branches of the common fibular nerve, and we went over the deep fibular nerve. The other branch is the superficial fibular nerve. Okay, right here. There we go. So superficial fibular nerve, right there. So you can see superficial and deep fibular nerve right next to each other, and they come from the common fibular nerve, which I showed you previously, right? And that comes from the tibial nerve, and those two nerves come from the sciatic nerve. Okay, now if I remove fibularis longus and brevis, I want to show you guys the fibular artery and vein. All right, so here it is. So I got all of the nerve vasculature and vascular selected. So again, we were seeing fibularis longus, fibularis brevis, and I wanted to show you guys the superficial fibular nerve, right? This is our superficial fibular nerve, right? Superficial fibular nerve, right? And that would be our deep fibular nerve, right? They all go up to the common fibular, and then sciatic, right? So sciatic, tibial, common fibular, and then deep and superficial fibular nerve. Right, now we can move on to the muscles of the posterior compartment. All right, so in the posterior compartment, you can see the tibial nerve, right? Tibial nerve, right? That's this nerve right here, the tibial nerve. And then coming off of the popliteal artery and vein, we see the posterior tibial artery and vein. Right, and coming off the posterior tibial artery and vein, we see the fibular artery and vein. And that's what I was trying to show you guys here, right? So the fibular artery and vein. Fibular artery and vein. So our fibular artery and vein is right here. Posterior tibial artery and vein is right here. Okay. If I remove some of these muscles of the posterior compartment, we're going to be able to actually see that. Okay. So we're going to start off with gastrocnemius. All right, so gastrocnemius, if I remove the two heads, so remember our posterior leg is supposed to plantar flex the ankle, so our toes are going to be going towards the floor. It's supposed to flex our toes and flex the knee. So plantar flex ankle, flex toes, and flex knee. So if I remove the gastrocnemius, going all the way from the femur to the calcaneus via the calcaneal tendon, which I was speaking about previously. Right under calcaneus is soleus. Soleus is going from the tibia to the calcaneus via the calcaneal tendon, right? Tibia and head of the femur. And head of the tibia, fibula. Sorry, the tibia and the head of the fibula, all the way to the calcaneal tendon. Okay. So the soleus is going all the way from the tibia and the head of the fibula all the way to the calcaneal tendon. So you remove that. So the gastrocnemius is going to be flexing the knee and plantar flexing the ankle, whereas soleus is just going to be plantar flexing the ankle. And with gastrocnemius, it makes sense that it's going to be flexing the actual knee because, right, its muscle attachments are, right, on the distal femur. Now we're going to move to popliteus, right? Popliteus is this muscle here. Right, this muscle is going to unlock the knee joint before it flexes. Right, it's going from, right, this is our lateral femur all the way to our tibia. So this is our lateral condyle of the femur to our tibia. And it's going to unlock the knee joint before extension. Sorry, not flexion, before extension. All right, so yeah, so popliteus here, right? It's functioning in unlocking the knee joint before flexion, not extension. I know I said flexion the first time, I was right. So it's going to be unlocking the knee joint before flexion, muscle before knee flexion. Now we're going to move on to the next muscle here. Right? So pay very close attention to this. So we spoke about the vasculature, we spoke about posterior tibial artery and vein, and then we spoke about the tibial nerve. Right? These are all the vasculature and neurovascular structures in the posterior that we need to know. All right, but when we look at the ankle, right, it tells us the muscles, right, the actual orientation of the muscles, right? So let's look at the ankle, right? So at the ankle, we have tibialis posterior, flexor digitorum longus, and then we have flexor hallucis longus. And a reminder that flexor hallucis longus, right, it goes all the way around the heel and goes to digit 1, right? So that's the tendon of flexor hallucis longus. Move the fascia there. So, right, we see it going all the way under the arch of the foot and to the first digit. Right, so at the ankle we see tibialis posterior, flexor digitorum longus, and flexor hallucis longus. Right, but when we go further up, right, more towards the proximal tibia, right, right now we're at the distal, right, so this is distal. If we go more towards the proximal tibia, the actual muscle, the order of the muscles actually differs, right? So we see, first we see flexor digitorum longus, then we see tibialis posterior, and then we see flexor hallucis longus, right? So if we're at the ankle, it's Tom, Dick, and Harry. So Tom being tibialis posterior, Dick being flexor digitorum longus, and Harry being flexor hallucis longus, right? When we're more towards the proximal tibia, it's different. And I use down the hatch. So flexor digitorum longus for down, tibialis posterior for the, so down the hatch, tibialis posterior, and then hatch is flexor hallucis longus. So that H is for hallucis. That T is for tibialis, and that D is for digitorum, right? So remember that when we're looking at the ankle and we're looking at the medial tibia, right, for the muscles in the posterior compartment, they differ, right? So make sure you know where you're looking at before you can judge what muscle it actually is, right? So if we're looking at the ankle, it's going to be slightly different than it is on the medial tibia and fibula, right? These muscles in the posterior compartment, right? And I want to also stress that what these muscles do. So tibialis posterior, it goes from the leg to the tarsals and is responsible for plantar flexing the ankle. Whereas flexor digitorum longus, it goes from the leg to the plantar surface of phalanges 2 through 5 and is responsible for plantar flexing the ankle and flexing the toes. Whereas the last muscle, right, so we're at flexor digitorum longus, right? The last muscle is flexor hallucis longus, right? This muscle goes from the leg to the plantar surface of phalanx 1, the big toe, and is responsible for flexing the big toe and plantar flexing the ankle. And I think that is everything for this unit. I hope this was helpful. I'm going to go ahead and post this. And good luck on your quizzes, guys.